Kia ora koutou and welcome to Markets, Mystics and Mayhem, a weekly podcast with Kiwi Bank's economics team alongside the occasional special guest. We'll delve into the data, decipher policy decisions, monitor the markets and analyse the issues impacting the Kiwi economy. Let's get into it. Kia ora, welcome back to the podcast. We're doing a bit of a remote session today. Jared's out on the road and I'm here in the office, but we thought we couldn't pass up talking about the Reserve Bank's latest decision. The Reserve Bank did, unsurprisingly, hold last week, but, it was the first hold since they started cutting in August. So there's really questions around, why did they pause? What happens from here? And we're really going to delve into all that was announced in the Reserve Bank's announcement. So, Jared, first off the cuff, what are your thoughts from last week?
Yeah, it's interesting. Quite a few central banks are stepping back and sort of saying, "Hey, we want to see what happens with the tariffs. We want to see what happens with this, with that, the next thing," and they're pausing. So we saw the Reserve Bank of New Zealand pause last week, as you mentioned. They've cut from 5.5 all the way down to 3.25. And they just wanted to take a breather, which, is understandable given the heightened uncertainty that there is globally, what that means for little old New Zealand. But also, within New Zealand itself, there's a lot of moving parts that I think they want to see a little bit more detail on. We don't think this is the end of the rate cutting cycle, like some commentators are saying. We think it's just a pause and that they'll start cutting again in August. And ultimately, we still think they go all the way down to 2.5 just to reignite the economy that needs support.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that message around how central banks are really in general taking this wait and see approach. Last week, we also saw the RBA also pause, and they were actually expected, market pricing had them expecting to cut. So they surprised quite a bit. And, they did point to sort of some tightness still in their labour market, but ultimately I think it did come down to the uncertainty and kind of seeing where things play out. Here at home, I think, we do have that global picture that the Reserve Bank and policymakers are all probably trying to feel out. I mean, that's still changing by the day. I think I wanted to say originally in this episode that I think we're past through the uncertainty being around how big tariffs might be and where we might end up. And we're actually more just now looking at the uncertainty around the impacts of these tariffs on inflation. But then you've also got, still changes happening. I think over the weekend we had some news of some re-escalation in tariffs between the EU, Canada and Mexico, and even potentially on that baseline rate. So we're definitely not out of the woods there yet. But then domestically, the Reserve Bank also kind of pointed to the near-term spike in inflation that we're seeing, which I thought was really interesting because, they acknowledged that it is just a spike and that in the medium term, they still see inflation coming back to 2% early next year. And, Jared, from our house view, we actually see that there's potentially downside risks to that number, potentially going below 2%, say 1.8%. So it's kind of interesting from my point of view that when policies, meant to be set for this medium-term outlook, and they're saying that medium-term inflation is contained and is going to converge back to their 2% sweet spot, that they're pausing now for this temporary spike.
Yeah. I think unpicking everything you just said, then it is the uncertainty bit. We haven't seen actual deals on the tariffs yet. We've seen a lot of threats and then dialing it back, and then even some more threats, as you say, over the weekend, and potentially dialing those back later on. So there's still a lot up in the air. Internationally, I think from the United States perspective, it is, how damaging is all of this to growth? And it is damaging, and how much of an impact is it going to be on inflation? And it is inflationary in the United States. But then when you whip around the world, growth forecasts have been downgraded, inflation in much much of the world, especially in Europe, is well contained. So, the outlook's actually softer on both growth and inflation, as you whip around the world and bring that back into New Zealand. So I think the good news here is that it is a temporary spike in inflation. What we're seeing in New Zealand around food prices and other things, that's temporary. The Reserve Bank's job is to look through that. We have an economy which is not really growing. It's been through a really bad recession last year, hasn't recovered, doesn't even look like it is actually recovering yet. So we have, what economists call this massive output gap where we should be growing. We'd like to be growing up here. This is our capacity. This is what we want to be growing at, but we're down here and there's this massive gap. So that's quite deflationary. So yeah, we've got a near-term spike. But inflation expectations are still relatively anchored. The disinflationary force is still feeding its way through. We see inflation actually falling below 2% next year. So with that view, we're sitting here saying, they shouldn't have paused last week. That was the wrong decision, in our opinion. They should have kept cutting. And I think ultimately they'll be sucked back into cutting. And cutting down to 2.5. So we've still got 75 basis points of cuts to come, we think. And that is when you start getting to levels where it actually bites and it actually clicks and it starts to feed, not just confidence, but activity in the economy.
Yeah, definitely. So I have a bit of a question feeding off on that as well is, one of the things I've heard you say a couple of times now is that these days, commentators were just arguing over 50 basis points left in the cutting cycle, whether they stop at 3, whether they go to 2.5. And, 50 basis points in the scheme of things after having 225 basis points of rate cuts isn't a lot, especially compared to last year, a bit earlier last year when there were still commentators calling for hikes and all that stuff. So in the grand scheme of things, the argument is less important now, but there is still some importance around whether monetary policy ends at that neutral rate, so say around 3%, and stimulatory, say 2.5%, right?
Yeah, definitely. You're right. Sort of a year ago, you had a couple of banks calling for hikes, and then you had a couple of banks, ourselves included, calling for cuts. That was a really, really wide debate. Now we're only debating over 50 basis points. Does that matter? Well, yeah, I think it does. I think it does. Because if we're wrong and they only cut to 3%, then current mortgage rates, current lending rates, that's, they're not going to move. That's it. The rate cuts have happened and they've been passed through. Whereas if we're right, excuse me, and they cut to 2.5, well, actually there's more downside to mortgage rates and lending rates in the economy. And I think what we've seen to date, we really do need to see that extra little bit to get people off the sidelines, and people are on the sidelines at the moment. If we look at everything that we know today,
mm-hmm.
when you're running the numbers with Mary Jo, what are they showing? Because I think we need to explain to people, why are you calling for output gap? What does that mean? What are our forecasts showing, and what are the key data points that you're looking at between now and August or now and the end of the year?
That's just where I was going to go. So I guess more specifically between now and August, the key data prints that we're looking at, and I say August because that's when the Reserve Bank is meeting again. So we've got inflation data out over the next coming week. You've got inflation expectations and labour market data further out in August. So now I think there's a few ugly parts in there for the Reserve Bank. You've got the inflation data, which, as we talked about, we are seeing this spike in inflation. I think the Reserve Bank has their forecast seeing inflation rising to 2.6%, but I think most of the higher frequency data, that's probably showing that it reaches a higher end of the Reserve Bank's target band, closer to 3%. So that's not going to look very nice for the Reserve Bank. And then off that, given that inflation expectations usually tend to follow inflation, we might also see a bit of a lift in inflation expectations later in August. On the other hand, though, we do have that labour market print, which some of the indicators there are looking pretty weak still, but also some of that higher frequency data, for example, things like your business PMIs, your services PSIs, they're continuing to flash in contraction. We did see quite a marked drop in business PMIs and PSIs last month. Potentially there was a bit of a look through that this time round because it was just a fall back into contraction. Maybe they're expecting it to just be a one-off, but the latest numbers show that we're still tracking in contraction there. So there's still some really ugly things there for the Reserve Bank, and they kind of have to just balance, there is this inflation here, but all your higher frequency activity data, that's showing weakness. And, that points to the output gap that we're running at, which the Reserve Bank did point out we have a significant or large negative output gap. So that's going to put your downward pressure on prices in the medium term.
I was disappointed, in that manufacturing data. I thought, we'd had, I think, 2 or 3 months where things actually sort of popped a little bit, looked like there was starting to be a bit more growth in the manufacturing sector, and then all of a sudden, bang, we're back in negative, we're back in contraction. That surprised me a bit, actually, on the softer side. So, this recovery, it's not set in stone, and, we're really limping, crawling out of this recession of last year, and we're just not there yet.
Yeah, and then there's the housing market too, right, which is really, after 225 basis points, is really not done quite what you think it would, right? That is a lot of rate relief in, a relatively short amount of time. In part, it maybe reflects how overcooked things were at the peak of interest rates. But yeah, if we look at the housing market, it's still really muted.
Yeah, well, the housing market is definitely muted. If we look at our forecast for the housing market this time last year, we had those sort of rate cuts coming through and actually starting to, bring about a bit more activity. We just haven't seen it. We've seen, false starts or green shoots, whatever you want to call them, but the green shoots, they die off really quickly. And, if we look at the latest numbers out from the RBA and RBNZ, house prices are flat on the year effectively. There's still a lot of stock in the housing market that's not clearing. So, households, investors trying to sell, not clearing, just struggling to get any bid out there. It's what, real estate agents deem to be a real buyer's market, and it is. Sellers are struggling to get stuff away. So there is a lot of weakness in the housing market still. So house prices have underperformed, our estimates, and we're the most dovish out there, and continue to underperform our estimates. So we've had to just keep pushing back our forecast bounce in house prices, because the reality is, it's been going sideways for 2 years. I was chatting to the Tauranga Property Investors Association last night, had about 100 people in the room, a lot of interest, a lot of discussion, a lot of talk. But when I asked them, what are you doing? Nothing. Why? Just not. And, I'm trying to rebuild equity, or I'm doing this, I'm doing that. But until the market actually starts recovering and they regain faith in the market, they're just on the sidelines. They're just not active at the moment. And some are worried about, future policy changes, which worries me. But most of them are just quite simply on the sidelines, rebuilding equity in their portfolio.
It seems like a little bit of a chicken and egg situation at the moment, because on one hand, you have people off the housing market still rebuilding equity, and the housing market remains, subdued. But until you kind of get a warm up in the housing market, you're also not going to see much activity in the New Zealand broader economy, because of the wealth effect, and people just aren't feeling quite as wealthy as they used to, with house prices still, down from their peak, and, struggling to make any gains.
Yeah, it's a big part of the New Zealand story, and the same with Australia and Canada and other countries. The housing market plays, an outsized role in our economy. If we're forecasting house prices to fall 20% as they did, then that feeds through the entire economy, via that so-called wealth effect, or people just feeling good or bad. At the moment, people are not feeling good because their house price has gone nowhere. Well, it's contracted and it hasn't recovered. So that the influence that the housing market has on households is pretty obvious, but also small businesses, right? Like a lot of small businesses will come to a bank and say, I want a loan, and we'll say, okay, here's your interest rate, but if you put a house next to it as collateral, here's your interest rate, which is obviously much, much lower. So there's a lot of small businesses out there that have got a house tied to their debt. So, they feel better about life when their house price is going up as well. We're just not there. The confidence is not there in the market. Like I said, chatting to all those investors last night, great conversations, great questions, a lot really interactive, went over time, but are they pulling the trigger? No, not yet.
Yeah, so I think that's in itself a really good piece of evidence that more stimulus is actually required. Interest rates have been lowered, but they're not quite at that rate where it's making, maybe people are hurting a bit less, but it's not at that rate where people are going for opportunities. They're just kind of sitting on their hands, as you said. And I think, you can say, oh, it's not just interest rates in the housing market right now that's keeping prices subdued. There's also the labour market that's deteriorating. That job insecurity is weighing on house prices. You've got net migration that just continues to plummet, really, and you still have an absence of investors. But at the end of the day, that all comes back to an economy that still needs more stimulus. So you've got quite a few signs and evidence there that, we're not at the end of this cutting cycle. We definitely shouldn't be.
Yeah, and it just, on the back of what you just said about migration, I actually had someone come up to me last night, works in horticulture, and saying, that chart that you've got about migration, dropping and looking like it's going to go further south. We're worried that we won't get the workers again. Like we had during COVID, we really struggled to make ends meet. We were paying Kiwis, he was saying, as much as $60 an hour because they were desperate to pick fruit off trees. And I thought, oh my goodness. And he was saying, I'm worried about that chart that you showed me of migration going south, because, what happens when I need to pick fruit again? So that's interesting. And I also got the sense that, he was talking to me about a business at a housing investors get together. But I do feel that, a lot of these investors are running businesses, they are working for businesses, and what they're seeing and feeling within business, I think, translates over into what they're seeing and feeling in the housing market. My business is really struggling. The businesses that I'm working with are really struggling. So, I'm not that excited, or I'm not that able to go out and buy investment property at the moment because the business is not doing too good.
it's kind of like when we talk about, and correct me if I'm wrong, but how in the US your stock market is that general feel for business confidence and household confidence, whereas in New Zealand it's the housing market that leads, right? So until we get, a bit more of a recovery there, things are looking still a bit tough. But, I think we're still optimistic, right, in our view. I mean, this year we've had to revise our forecast a bit lower, say 2 to 3% gains by year end. But, back looking forward to next year, once we've had those interest rates come through reductions that we need, we still see the housing market, recovering towards 5 to 7% gains.
Yeah, and that's how I start my presentations, funnily enough. I stand up and I say, if there's one thing I want you to take away from today, it's that we are optimistic, but it does require a few more rate cuts. And if that's not delivered, our level of optimism will come down. But yeah, based on our forecasts, that the Reserve Bank does what's needed, and cutting below 3, 275 I can live with, but we really want 2.5. If that's delivered, then we're going to have much better growth next year, which is why I really sort of scratch my head when I'm reading the Reserve Bank's assessment of the current situation. I mean, I just really struggle for them to sit there doing nothing when there's so much hurt in the economy. But yeah, we're optimistic. Absolutely, we're optimistic. We know that businesses are amazing at adapting to very difficult situations. They are adapting. They will continue to adapt. They will get stronger. Things will rebound next year. It's just a matter of how much. In my discussions, actually in the Q&A of my presentation last night, had a lot of questions around migration, like why are we losing Kiwis? Where are they going, and what's the driver? What does it mean for New Zealand? So why don't you tell us what's happening in migration, and how we feel about that?
Yeah, I think migration's such an interesting data point to have watched over the past 2 years, because you've really gone from one extreme to almost another. We went from 2023 having record-breaking net migration growth, come back to today, and actually we're running quite below, the long-term average of around 20,000. And what we've really seen is it's really just a story of labour markets when it comes to migration growth, particularly when it's between us and Australia. If you look at the Australian labour market, it's sitting at 4.1%. Here at home, we're at around 5.1%. So that labour market pool's really strong. Sorry, unemployment rate.
Yeah.
And we're kind of seeing a bit of two things play out. On one hand, arrivals have cooled off their peaks, so they're settling lower now as well. But we're also still seeing a record number of Kiwi departures as well, to Australia for the likes. And how do we feel about that? Well, it's a bit concerning, to think, as you mentioned, that maybe we're going to end up having a net migration loss, given that departures are still, haven't reached their peak just yet. I think it does, I think it's a real sign of the state of the economy, and it does, put risk eventually on labour market pressures. But at the moment, I think that just shows you there's still deflationary pressure out there as well. You're getting rid of people, that demand's being lost. That's why the housing market is largely the way it is as well. So it's not good. I think it would have been nice to have settled back at our long-term average levels, but it's probably just such a stark contrast to where we were, 2 years ago.
Yeah, it's really symptomatic of our current state, isn't it? Our economy's weak, Australia's economy is stronger, even the UK and Europe, look quite attractive to Kiwis. So we're losing them, and the question is, we train. They go through our schools. We train these people. They go through university, and then they head overseas. And that is the Kiwi way, but it does, get worse. And at the moment, it's quite bad. I think this is the worst outflow we've ever recorded. Is that right on the data?
I have to double check.
Pretty close.
But pretty close.
It's pretty close. It's a huge outflow of Kiwi heading over to Australia. Who are we attracting in? Well, we're attracting in young people as well. So we're losing young people as a demographic, and we're gaining young people from different parts of the world. India first, Philippines, China, United States, those running away from Trump, South Africa. There's a long list of where of these migrants come from. Are we getting like for like? But my answer is also that Kiwis come home. So I left for 16 years and came home because at the end of the day, New Zealand's New Zealand. It's still, if not it's definitely close to being the most beautiful country in the world. And a lot of Kiwis ultimately return. I just want to remind listeners that my favourite quote from a politician was from Rob Muldoon in the 1980s, where he was talking about the brain drain from New Zealand to Australia, and he said, it's fine. Kiwis heading to Australia increase the average IQ of both countries. So I quite like that one.
That's a good quote, and you're totally right. We have seen, for example, when the Aussie mining boom took place, we did see that huge outflow of Kiwi migrants, and then only for them to really come back home after the boom was kind of over. So we do see it. It's not necessarily a permanent new way of being. It's just really a sign of the state of the economy, as you put it.
So in summarising all of that, there's a lot of uncertainty out there in the world right now that central banks are trying to get their heads around, and fair enough. We still think that the Kiwi economy needs a little bit more support. We'd like to see a few more rate cuts down to 2.5, just to really put the economy on a firmer footing into next year to get a little bit more growth. But at the end of the day, we are optimistic, and we're optimistic because we believe in the Kiwi economy. We believe we will bounce back harder, a little faster, with some rate cuts into next year. So that was it from us this week. Thank you for dialing in. Please subscribe, give us some comments. Tell us what you want to see on the podcast. Cheers.
You've been tuned into This is Kiwi Economics, Markets, Mystics and Mayhem. We'll be back next week for more analysis and insights.
Any views or information shared in this podcast, while given in good faith, aren't necessarily the views of Kiwi Bank.